Okay, so for the next hour, I'd like to invite up on stage again Mike Schuessler, Professor Jackie Arendse, Ronald King, and joining them for conversation, Professor Stephen Friedman and Christa Janse van Rensburg as well. Could you all join me up on stage? There we have it. Let's get straight into some conversation, and I'd like to echo right at the top, this is a regional broadcast, so could participants joining us from those regional centers start sending through your questions via Twitter? That's exactly how you're going to be getting involved in today's conversation. For you with us in the room this morning, of course, we've got roving microphones doing the round, as I mentioned at the top, so don't feel shy. We've got this esteemed panel of guests at your disposal this morning. Let's start off perhaps with a generic overview, though, and get some perspective at this point. Perhaps, Mike, when it comes to the overall economic climate, I mean, with the rand back above 1080 straight after the budget announcement yesterday, some were highlighting, and I picked this up on Twitter feed yesterday, that the market certainly showed no confidence. And I've said this before, but it was described as a muddle-along budget. Your view there?
Well, look, it certainly wasn't an election budget. It certainly wasn't an austerity budget. And under those circumstances, I think people are looking at some of the numbers and they don't find it quite believable that you're under a low growth scenario, that your budget deficit falls to under 3%. And people have become used to the fact that the minister has been saying our total government debt to GDP will not increase above 38%, then it was 40%, it definitely wasn't going above 40%. Now it became 44.3%, but that's on the net debt. If you compare it to other countries, they use gross debt, so that's 48.5%. People are saying, well, that's already quite a bit of a difference. And I think it's part of the believability of us sticking to our numbers that's also coming through there under those circumstances. So I think people are a little bit wary in the markets as to our ability to make the budget happen, so to speak. People know that we've got a good collection record. We sometimes overspend a bit. And those are the type of areas I think people are going to be looking out for.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take focus now to you on the stage, Christa, looking at productivity specifically. Some comment that came through from Grant Thornton yesterday. A targeted focus on infrastructural expenditure should have a positive impact on employment, and the relaxation of regulatory requirements for conducting business should also help eliminate unnecessary impediments to productivity. What do you make of a comment like that out there?
Well, obviously, the issue of productivity is one that's at the core of the labour movement in general. We believe that productivity is something that you must link specifically to growth and also to growth in wages. It's an issue that we debate often. Mike was at FEDUSA's collective bargaining conference a week or two ago, and we discussed this matter at length to say, does productivity growth correlate with wage growth in the economy? Now, you will find a lot of different camps on this matter. Specifically, you'll see that owners of businesses typically would agree that no, it does not. Whereas the labour movement and a lot of their economists would go to great lengths to prove to you that actually due to mechanization and job losses in the economy, productivity is in fact growing steadily.
Yeah. Jackie, when it comes to those headline fiscal numbers, I mean, we were surprised slightly to the positive, deficit to 4% of GDP, that narrowing to 2.8% by 2016-2017, revenue collection at 899 billion to 1 trillion next year, expenditure restraint a key focus, and that showing some keeping to non-interest expenditure ceilings, but the risk therein is that 2.7% growth target. So perhaps we're being a bit too optimistic on that front. How much risk are you pricing in?
Well, of course, when one looks at that growth target, 2.7%, I think, and look at what we've achieved over the last few years, it possibly is a bit of an overstretch. If we look at growth around the world, I think we're looking at 3.6% growth internationally, but 5.5% in Africa. And so we're seeing a lot of growth around Africa, but of course, in South Africa itself, we are not seeing that level of growth. So the risk of us actually achieving those tax projection targets, well, so far we've done okay. In fact, at the end of this year, we've come in better than the target that was set at the medium-term budget in October. So it seems that up until now, we seem to be reaching those targets, but it remains to be seen. I think there is quite a risk that perhaps we might be getting a little bit optimistic around reaching those targets with the current tax environment. I just don't think it's as realistic.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, we see it more of a budget, more of a rallying cry by Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan from the Conservative centre-left of the ANC for government to get its act together, to waste less and spend money more efficiently. That's some of the international commentary. It came through from Nomura yesterday. Your response to that and your overall view on Budget 2014 from that perspective?
Well, I think I'm quite interested in international commentary because, including the rating agencies, it's popular in our environment when you want to say things but would prefer to put them in the mouth of others to say that the international investment community or the rating agencies said that. I think the evidence is pretty clear that really these are domestic opinions being filtered through international organizations. So the point of that is that the real issue is domestic. The real issue is the relationship between government and business within the society, and more broadly between government, business, and the rest of the society. And I think in that context, if you look at a budget delivered just before an election, the first election, in my view, since 1994, in which, rightly or wrongly, the governing party is more worried than it's ever been before about retaining votes, about not losing votes. If you consider that we're a society marked by very high levels of poverty and inequality, then I think that this budget is sending an extraordinarily loud message to business. And the loud message to business is that government does want to work with business. The temptations in this environment to do all sorts of things, which would have been done in many other societies I can think of in order to win votes, has been resisted. The minister has talked at great length about the importance of private sector investment and private sector job creation, and has announced has emphasized various measures which are meant to encourage that. Now, I think the issue is less whether you think those measures are entirely appropriate. Obviously, that's worth debating. But the issue to me quite clearly is that this is trying to send reassuring messages to the business community and to the investment community. But I think also that one needs to put that into context. If one reads the whole speech, if one reads everything the minister is saying, he's really saying, and I think that is the government approach at the moment, that government does want to work with business, but that poverty and inequality and the kind of problems they create for our economy are still central in government's thinking, and that government hopes that business will work with it to address those issues as well as obviously the pressing issue of growth. And I think that message came through very clearly in the budget.
Yeah, you're certainly echoing comments yesterday where it was highlighted that the budget announcement struck somewhat of a conciliatory tone. Ronald, let's shift focus to investor or the investment community at large, whether it be foreign or local. I mean, how did you think the budget resonated there, and was enough confidence instilled in terms of economic policy moving forward?
It's a very difficult one to say. We were very surprised by the interest rate hike recently. So I had the privilege in 2 weeks ago to go and visit the UK to do some due diligences on fund managers there, and went into a restaurant to eat a steak and saw that a 1.1 kilogram T-bone now costs £99 or 1,800 Rand. Now, if we go back to parity on exchange rates, that means that the Rand is currently extremely cheap, probably blown out a little bit beyond reason. So I think that even though we have this massive budget deficit that's growing, which makes us one of the fragile five, I think that on the shorter term, we will probably see the Rand coming back, strengthening a bit, not because of anything in a trust that was built in the budget as such, but just because of, like with everything in South Africa, we either overdo it or don't do it at all. So I think at this stage, on the short term, the Rand would probably strengthen. On the long term, however, those other risks and our increasing deficit will be a problem. But when you look at investments for your clients, you shouldn't be making that decision purely based on the exchange rate, because if you were to land with a spaceship in this world, you would definitely not put all of your money in South Africa, and I think that is the sound principle of financial planning.
Okay, well, we've got the Twitter feed live and active, and the questions are coming through. One from Andre Lindick, who's posed a question to Mike. Mike, you've stated that in the next 6 years that the private sector will be, or privatization rather, will be on the increase. What does the EFF say? So as much as that commentary is being made, we know that there's a resistance. It is very much a political hot potato. Your comment to that?
Well, I think we're hitting a reality now with slow growth, that there is not that much room to tax the narrow tax base in South Africa ever more. And I think there's a slow realization that, you know, you end up paying a lot for the government enterprises. You know, should the question arise, we already spend a lot of our money on SAA because we give them government guarantees. The cost of that government guarantee at the moment, if they can't pay, would be 7.9 billion Rand. That's also in the annexures of the budget. And the same, you know, applies to many state-owned enterprises. I suspect that something like Eskom probably won't be privatized, but I think that they may allow private producers to come to the rescue, because we cannot ourselves give the sort of money for the BUILD program that these guys are wanting, because if you take government debt with the government guarantees, we're already nearing 55% or so. And I think, you know, ultimately, a lot of those guarantees we're going to have to guarantee. In actual fact, we're going to have to pay out. So, you know, if an enterprise hasn't made money for 16 years, such as SAA, you know, it is not very clever keeping it under the present situation. So I think that's one thing. And the thing is, you can increase your tax rate. If you look at the biggest privatization in the world, that was actually in China. The most enterprise, the most money got through, and so on. And that's a communist country. So it shows you that things do change.
Stephen, was enough said in your books in terms of comments around support from government on the NDP? A lot of emphasis being placed on the fact that the foundation has been laid and it's up to the next administration to take over. What is your comment there? Cedar Wealth coming through with that, and also questioning the effect of elections this year on the budget and ultimately affecting the rand.
Look, I'm always tempted at these gatherings when I'm asked about the NDP to really be incredibly nasty to everybody here and invite everybody here who's expressed an opinion on the NDP to indicate whether they've ever read the NDP. Because whenever I try the exercise, the ratio between those who talk about the NDP and those who've actually read it is like about 1 to 1,000. And that's important because I think that, in business thinking and in labor thinking in this country, the NDP has become a fetish. It's become this straightforward, market-friendly document which Labour hates and business loves. Now, if you bother to read it, it's actually quite a complicated document. It's got a lot of market-friendly proposals, and it's got quite a lot of interventionist proposals. And really, as I've been arguing all along, the sensible way to approach the NDP is that if you're an interest group in this country, or if you're in government in this country, you take the bits of the NDP you like, and you push them and you ignore the bits that you don't like. And in effect, that's what the minister is doing, and that's what the government is doing, that's what everybody is doing. Now, I found it very interesting yesterday that when the minister was talking about the NDP, that he was at pains to stress that the NDP was, as he put it, that at the center of the NDP, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I think I've got the quote more or less correct, is a social compact to deal with poverty and inequality. In other words, what I was talking about earlier, in other words, a negotiated agreement between the various economic stakeholders in this country with setting out measures that we're all going to take to ensure that the economy grows in an inclusive way, that poverty and inequality becomes less of a problem in our society. And that is certainly a legitimate reading of the NDP. So I think that we really need, if we're going to move forward as a society, economically, we really need to get rid of this NDP fetishism. I think everybody in this room, everybody in this society, if you think the NDP is important, should look at the NDP, identify the areas which you think you find attractive, and lobby for those areas, and obviously oppose the areas you don't. But obviously, what the minister was doing yesterday, precisely because the fetish was there, is but part of the symbol he was sending was that everything he said was wrapped in the cloak of the NDP, and that, as I indicated earlier, was supposed to send calming messages to the markets. That obviously has its place in the short term, but in the longer term, I think, as a society, we need to look at the concrete issues of growth and development rather than fixating on misreadings of a document.
Of course, when it comes to closing that inequality gap, Christa, very big emphasis being placed on SMEs. We had the Davis Committee's recommendations to an extent being paid attention there, and yet we've got commentary still doing the rounds, and Voter Fourie coming through saying not enough in the budget to develop entrepreneurship. Your stance on that?
FEDUSA has always been a champion of SMMEs, and it's something that often our colleagues in Braamfontein don't agree with us upon, because we believe that big business, to some extent, do not need that kind of protection and promotion, where small businesses are the real job creators in our country. We need to look after them, we need to make it easy for them to do business, and we need to create an environment where they can flourish to enhance our economic growth. I just want to also touch on the National Development Plan. I think it's important to understand that the National Development Plan is a working document. Now, we've engaged with Minister Trevor Manuel and Cyril Ramaphosa on the document. We've made some proposals as a federation, and we were told that it is a working document and it actually signals a point of consensus between different factions. And Prof. Friedman is correct by analyzing it as such. But I think rather than seeing it as a negative document, let's rather see it as a working document that we can use to work around and state our policy positions.
Mike, we've got FA News Online saying, does government need to perhaps relook at the NDP growth targets and be more realistic?
Well, I think what's becoming clear is that all growth forecasts, both from the government, private sector, you name it, have all been revised downwards in the last 3 years or so. And I suspect this year's growth target, specifically from government, is going to be revised down further. I think that's likely to happen. And I think the reality is that for the next while, it's very difficult to see where growth is going to come from. Just take an example. If we try to open a new smelter, there's no electricity. If you want a new coal mine and you want to take coal out, there's no capacity. If you have an iron ore mine in Northern Cape, it's difficult to get that capacity on that line at this moment in time, and we have to add capacity, but it takes time to add that capacity. So for the next while, there's no way that South Africa is going to join the rest of the world in the same way on a recovery stage. Just one thing on small business, which I don't understand, but we're going to have, they haven't announced anything on the turnover tax. So a turnover tax on a company of 1 million rand turnover, that's really, really small. And many of these companies have a profit margin that's far below 5%. So ultimately, you're taking all of their profit margin into taxes, and the person is going to have nothing to survive. I really think that's the other problem. I think you can't have big government and big business talking and deciding about small businesses. It just doesn't help. We've had this NEDLAC thing. NEDLAC is sitting in a problem where anything that you want to bury, you send to NEDLAC. It never gets out there. It's like a box. It's a magic box. You can park everything there. And it goes on around in circles. So, you know, the point is that's big business, big labor, and big government. There's no small business there. There's no Zamas there. There's no taxi drivers at NEDLAC. You know, it doesn't happen. And ultimately, that's an area that we've got to look at, how that can create business or jobs. In Africa, for example, 48% of all the people working in Africa are self-employed. In South Africa, it's about 7%. So we need to relook at that type of opportunity that presents itself, because we're totally out of sync with emerging markets in the number of entrepreneurs that we have as a percentage of our workforce. Absolutely out.
Especially if we want to get those investment and savings levels up. Ronald, many people picking up from your address this morning the fact that you highlighted South Africans are recklessly conservative in the way they invest. Question, will Provident funds continue into the future? Is there no new news on compulsory preservation of retirement proceeds?
I do not think it's so important to understand whether Provident funds would remain or not. The main important question is basically, will they be required to preserve that within a living annuity? If that goes through, then it can be called a pension or a Provident fund, because the rules will be exactly the same. The problem, unfortunately, is that most of the Provident funds are owned by unions, or there's a lot of union participation in them, and it's very, very difficult to negotiate with them to come into a position where they say, we are happy to accept that our members can suddenly not access their money upon a retirement. We have found it, and it's something that was mentioned in the previous budget as well, as part of this, that we find that there's a number of, or a substantial amount of employees who retire or resign every December, take their pension money, and then come back in February and reapply for the work, just to use their retirement savings as a kind of a savings vehicle, short-term savings vehicle. And this is something that government has picked up on, but unfortunately, it is not just something that they would be able to push through, especially not in an election year. So probably we will see a stronger stance on preservation in next year's budget again.
Jackie, while we're on the note, David Thompson saying, do you expect, question, in light of the compulsory preservation and limited commutation of retirement funds, why lower the 18% tax band?
Right, I would imagine he's referring to the retirement fund lump sum table, where we said that the tax-free band had been raised from 315 to 500,000, and then the next band is the 18% band, and that limit has been raised from 630,000 up to 700,000. So there's been a sort of a 10% increase there, but obviously not as generous an increase as we saw on the tax-free band. I think the reason why that approach has been taken, in fact, the Minister alluded to it in his budget speech, is he mentioned that they wanted to give more relief to people who hadn't benefited from tax deductions on their contributions going into the funds. And we mustn't confuse this with the disallowed contribution that doesn't qualify for deduction. I think the idea here is people who are not able to access the tax benefit of those contributions because their earnings are too low, and yet when they get the payout from the fund, they end up being taxed on the payout because their lump sum exceeded the 315,000. So I think that's really the focus of where the benefit was, for the people to get more lump sum tax-free. And then the rest of the table has been adjusted, as I say, marginally, just not as generously, but there have been adjustments in the other tables as well, other parts of the table as well.
Okay, we're going to let the Twitter feed rest for a bit in case any of you in the audience have any questions. Are there any questions from our audience members, any of our audience members here with us today? None? Okay, well, let's take it back then. Jackie, still with you. A study of the relationship between CGT and estate duty needs to be done. What's your comment there?
Well, the problem is that with estate duty and capital gains tax, upon a person's death, obviously we understand there's estate duty payable on the net value of that estate, but the person is also deemed to have disposed of all of their assets immediately before they die, and in most cases that's going to give rise to a capital gains tax liability. So you have a double liability that arises. Sure, the normal tax that flows out of the capital gains tax liability, that does become a liability, and this is getting very technical now, but it reduces the value of the estate. So there's a marginal amount of relief there, but there is still an element of double tax when a person dies. And a few years ago it was mentioned that some thought was being given to phasing out estate duty and rather just focusing on the capital gains aspect. But that hasn't really developed. Nothing has progressed in that regard. I do think, in fact I'm pretty sure it's on the Davis Committee agenda to pick up on that discussion and have a look to see what should be done. Of course, we've also seen that estate duty abatement of 3.5 million has not increased, as I said, since 2007, 2008. So we are sitting with a situation where the exemption has been kept fixed. Inflation has overtaken that, so you are ending up with quite a bit of additional tax being collected just by keeping that exemption at a fixed level. So it'll be interesting to see what the Davis Committee comes out with in terms of wealth taxes, capital transfer taxes, etc.
So while we're with you, and I know I'm sticking to you here, but a lot of questions on tax coming through. Do you expect the conduit tax principle for trusts to be scrapped by the Davis Commission recommendation?
Well, that's, of course, trusts, everybody's a little bit worried about what's going to happen with trusts after the Minister's announcement in last year's budget speech. This year, absolutely nothing was said about trusts. And in fact, the Davis Committee, yes, as part of the whole review of wealth taxes, etc., would obviously be looking at trusts. Do I think they're going to scrap the conduit pipe principle? That is quite a complex aspect. It's a well-entrenched principle in our legislation. Personally, I can't see that it's going to be scrapped, but anything is possible. But there are a lot of complexities around trusts. One cannot just take one firm stand and say we're going to tax trusts in this particular manner, because there's as many different types of trusts as there are different people sitting in this room. So you can't come up with one firm rule to say that's how we're going to tax it.
Okay, Ronald, you've got a comment on the back of that.
Yes, I would just like to say that we must remember that when we create trusts, we shouldn't be doing it for tax reasons. Trusts are still the cheapest way to afford a girlfriend. Because if your wife finds out and you do not have your assets in a trust, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So please remember that the reasons for trusts being part of the English legislation, the English law for so long, and our law as well, is for two other reasons. First and foremost, that it is the best way to protect assets. and it's also the best way to ensure continuity of an asset base. So if you are looking at using trusts in your estate planning and your financial planning for clients, do not do it because of the fact that you want to save taxes. Do it because of the fact that you want to protect assets and you want to ensure continuity.
So on the back of that tip then, Mike, do you have any tips for Mr. Gordon or whoever takes over to stimulate growth, increase tax and satisfy regulators over the next 5 years?
Well, there's a lot of things that one can do. There's things that are going to cost you a little bit of money. That would be tax breaks, say more tax breaks on the business side of things, particularly smaller business, medium-sized business. But I think South Africa's problem goes beyond taxes and expenditure. It certainly has too many rules. It has too many regulations. It makes life difficult to compete with other countries. BEE adds another form of tax, if you wish. We have very high administrative taxes or prices, which is another form of tax. Things like the toll fees that we're all paying. Ultimately, those are the type of things that are starting to have an impact on the South African economy. For example, would you really put up another smelter in South Africa even if it had the power? Well, in America, there's a gas revolution, and you can now produce the same amount of energy at a quarter of our price. So if you're going to put up a smelter, you're more likely to put it up in America these days than you are in South Africa. So we must find areas where we've got a competitive advantage. I think we must look north to Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is the world's second fastest growing region. I think we must do a lot more than just expenditure by the state and taxes by the state, but we should look at things like border controls, how to make it. He's done an example in this budget, but we shouldn't have lines of lorries having to wait days at borders in Africa. We should have a way that passports that we can go into other African countries and they can come here a lot easier. We've opened the door for Zimbabweans and Mozambicans. We must ask that the same be done for our people all around, so that we can take our truck drivers or bus drivers or whatever very quickly, and open skies policies or whatever the case may be. We've got to find a way to tie ourselves into Africa a lot quicker than we have up to now, and we've got to find a way to encourage the smaller guys to come into business, and then over time to make them more formal. So those are the sort of broader things that we should do. I don't think it's only up to the finance ministry, however. I think, ironically, the tax man is very often more friendly to business than some of the actual business departments in government.
Mm-hmm. Okay, hopefully that's warmed the room up a little bit. So any questions from the floor? There we go.
Afternoon, morning. Can you hear me? I'm Sharon Smolders, Head of Tax Technical at SITE. I've got a question for the panel, or maybe just a suggestion on the small business issue first, because that's where my passion lies. Is you mentioned, SARS is quite friendly to small businesses. I've got a lot of them that would disagree with that statement at this stage. But on the bigger level, shouldn't we get a Minister of Small Businesses sitting in Parliament, somebody to actually take responsibility for this sector? It's sitting across all different ministries at the moment, and no one's taking ultimate responsibility for it. But my question actually comes in the form of the employment tax incentive. I think that's something that we haven't mentioned. 56,000 people benefited from it this month, the first month that it was operational in January. I'd like to just hear your comments and views on that incentive.
Well, I think the incentive is then virtually taken up, because I think there's only 800 million available for it. And if you then say that 56,000 you're going to be paying 1,000 each, say, then that means it's 56 million in that month. And that's getting us quite close to the amount that we can. But that's a very pleasing thing to see. And it says where you can incentivize and bring people into the labor market, because it is a well-known fact that you want people with experience, and the people without experience struggle to get onto that ladder, and it takes them a while to gain that experience. So that's a very clever thing. On the small business, just one thing, what I think we need is maybe, yes, a Minister of Small Business, but I think we need better understanding, and we also need government to realize that they've been talking to big business and big labor all along. They haven't been listening to the chambers. They haven't been listening to the little organizations out there, the Soweto Executive Business Council or whatever, and they've been listening to the wrong people very often. And those guys are more interested in how venture capital works, or they want to know how their shares are going to be sorted out, and and their structures and so on when they do a BEE deal. They really haven't been talking to the micro and the small business, the man on the street, the main street businesses. They haven't been, because that noise isn't there. If you open any newspaper, business newspaper, it's more about the big companies, the shares of big companies, and also politics. They have many political commentators, but they don't have anybody writing about small business. So if you go to any major newspaper today, they don't have anything. They don't have facts and figures on small businesses. They don't know what's going on. They don't know our deficit in small business. So society is poorer for that. And what I do mean with SARS, I think SARS sometimes treats small business with more respect than, for example, the DTI does, or the Department of Labor does, or whatever. And I think, for example, employment equity or all labor rules should be thrown off the table for any company that has less than 20 employees, for example. That was on the table in 1998, and big business stopped that. So I think I agree with Krista, big business does not need the protection, but small business needs a chance.
On that note, Stephen, let's get commentary from you, because many were surprised by that 56,000 number on the back of the youth wage subsidy being employed, and some saying we still need more tax incentives for business for first-time employees. For example, the FPI mentorship programs, etc. Your view there?
Well, I think before that, let me just answer the question which the lady there raised in two ways. I mean, first of all, the best way to answer your question is to say that some colleagues and I some years ago did a research exercise on youth policy in Southern Africa, and we discovered that only one country besides South Africa didn't have a youth ministry. We also discovered that only one country besides South Africa actually had coherent and successful youth policies. It was the same country, Botswana. And I think there's a lesson for that. To me, as a student of government and politics, if you want to make the issue of small business entirely irrelevant for the next 20 years, the best way to do that is to form a small business ministry, because then everything gets shunted to the small business ministry, nothing happens, and that's the end of the story. So the answer is, if you're interested in small business, do whatever you can to oppose a small business ministry. That said, the claim, I think we need to be specific about what's going on here. The claim that government does not talk to small business chambers is false. Why do we know it's false? Because not long ago, Minister Davies announced legislation which, quite rightly in many ways, was very unpopular with many people, forcing all sorts of new onerous controls on small traders and informal traders, etc. And it transpired that the reason that he was doing that is that he'd received a lobby from formal small traders who were trying to put their informal small trader competitors out of business. So to me, that's quite important. It's not just an anecdote. I think that when we talk about small business not being listened to, I don't think that's correct. When you talk about something else, and that is a major South African problem, and that is informal businesses, people out there making a living in all sorts of ways, which gets frowned upon and not taken seriously because they don't do it in the way in which folks like us do it. In other words, they don't put on ties in the morning and go into air-conditioned office. They do their business on the streets. I think that is a major South African problem, and certainly those people are not listened to in the slightest. One other point, and this is changing the subject entirely, one other point which came up earlier, which I think I need to just alert us all to. I hope my concerns about it don't turn out to be valid, but it's the question of pension preservation, which has a great deal of support among professional people, among sections of business, etc. Now, there is a particular problem with pension preservation, and that is some of us are sadly old enough to remember that in the 1980s in this society, a proposal for pension preservation sparked off 18 months of strike activity. And the reason for that, or the stated reason for that, and really I'm not taking a view, I mean I can see the arguments for preservation, but the view which was taken at the time by the trade unions was that pension preservation works very well for people, A, who expect to spend many years in retirement, and B, who have reasonable job security. The argument was made that if you have very poor job security and you have a lot of pressure on your income, and quite frankly, given the statistics, you don't expect to have a long retirement anyway, it makes far more sense to be able to get your money out when you lose your job rather than to keep the money there until you find another job. Now, whether that is a valid argument or not, we may be dealing with a situation in which there were 18 months of strikes on preservation because there was a minority government, and we now no longer have a minority government, but we may be dealing with a serious issue here, and I think it would be a pity for our country if this wasn't taken into account. So I think the implication of that is that if you think that preservation is a good idea, and as I say, there are many arguments for it, this really is something which is going to have to be negotiated. This is really something which is going to have to be canvassed with the trade unions, because there is at least a prospect that if we don't do that, we could have troubles later on.
Ronald, do you have any comments on the back of the final comment that Stephen made?
No, I think that is exactly the issue. And there is also, of course, the other issue at this stage that there's the means test for getting the old age pension. So the quicker you have no means left, the quicker you can get an old age pension, which is one of the reasons why preserving is currently to the detriment of a number of the people. So we would definitely have to see a lot of changes. There would have to be provisions for when losing your work, but in the end, I have to agree that this will have to be negotiated, because the chances are that if it's not a negotiated settlement, we will have strikes for a very long time.
Krista, let's bring it back to the small business conversation. Lots of conversation in the run-up to this year's budget around jobs versus job opportunities, so the quality of that job. And comment just coming through, ETI for job creation is 800 million, expenditure for sanitation 15.4 billion. Do we have a focus more so on toilets than on job creation?
That's an interesting point. The issue of the kind of jobs, I want to first touch on that. I've been to a few conferences where the issue of decent work is frowned upon. And I feel like Professor Friedman said about the National Development Plan, I dare everyone here to go and look exactly what are the 4 pillars of decent work. Decent work is something all of us want. It's not, a decent work doesn't refer to getting a salary that makes you afford a certain kind of motor vehicle. It's the very basic things that we expect of a job, of a livelihood. And I find it strange when people, specifically popular economists, frown upon the term to say, no, we should rather have jobs than we have decent jobs. Or a decent job is worse than no job, or something to that effect. I think that is, it actually tells us that this person didn't read up on the term as such. To come back to SMMEs and job creation, it's important to understand that jobs are created when there is growth potential in a specific sector. Now, if you limit that potential through issues like lack of competition that Mike referred to earlier, you will not have new jobs being created. And with the sophistication of the current players in that specific sector, you will see actually jobs being lost for the simple reason that capital, if I can call it that, will always find ways to avoid costs and maximize profit. It's the nature of the beast. So mechanization and ways to avoid additional human resource burdens on their balance sheet is what they will aim for.
Mm-hmm. Jackie, with the pressure on various sectors still being exerted, does more need to be, and I go back to a question I asked earlier, does more need to be done in terms of tax incentives for business for first-time employees?
Well, the employment tax incentive, I gather you're referring to that and whether we should extend that. Of course, the employment tax incentive is not only focused on first-time employees. You could be bringing in people who have been employed previously, but they fall within the frame of a qualifying employee, which is pretty much they're young, etc. Should we be doing more to create jobs effectively, bring in first-time employees? Well, anything that stimulates growth, I think, is what we need. But things always come at a cost, and the issue is, can we, do we have the funds available to support this type of initiative? Anything that you want to put on the table in terms of tax incentive has to be compensated with additional revenue somewhere, because the money has to come from somewhere. So is that the best use of money right now? It also depends on how effective it is. It's one thing to put an incentive on the table, but is there going to be the uptake, and is it actually going to translate into more jobs? We've seen very encouraging numbers quoted by the Minister around the employment tax incentive. 56,000 people having benefited even after the first month. That's not 56,000 employers. I would gather that's 56,000 employees who have come into the system, and the employers have made use of the employment tax incentive. So it does look, contrary to our concerns previously that perhaps not enough employers were aware of the incentive, etc., it does look as if people are making use of that incentive. And if an incentive is successful, then I do support perhaps investing more into that incentive. But perhaps take something that's working and then boost that. Yeah.
Mike, you spoke about Africa and the opportunity that Africa presents for our growth story moving forward. What's our competitive advantage compared to other countries, and then compared to the BRICS nations as well?
Okay, I think our focus now has moved to BRICS, which is unfortunate. I think our focus should be on Africa. It's very, very difficult to find where we have a competitive advantage on, for example, China in Africa. We certainly are not going to sell African cell phones, but what we're good at is branding. We do import goods, put them in a box, put nice labels on, and send them further. I don't think we should underestimate that. But I think we have an area that we could do a lot with. If we can get certainty, for example, on properties around the country, which was one of the other things that the Minister mentioned as an aside. But the fact of the matter is, then people would invest in their farms. We could do food production. If we get the roads going there, that food production could go to factories. Those factories could make the jams and the tomato sauces, and those are the things that we sell to Africa at the moment. We sell a lot of food. Africa's a lot poorer than we are, and they will buy food, and we can brand it. We can do all those things. They also buy services from us, but that's at the higher end, where they buy the accountants and the architects and the engineers time from us very often. But I think for the majority of people where our unemployment is in the rural areas, we can make a big difference if we link up certain sectors and we focus on them more in Africa. For example, the motor industry is a very expensive sector at the moment to be in, and now that things are coming through that we are not going to get to the sort of targets of 1.2 million cars manufactured in South Africa. I think it's in 2020. I'd like to say something on small business, just in another way. I've been a member of a chamber for about 16 years. I've represented small business in Johannesburg and in Gauteng for about 12 or 14 years. I have seen where radio station PR stunts, I call them sometimes, like Lead SA. It's a nice concept, nothing wrong with it. But where the city authorities rather listen to Lead SA than they listen to chambers that are bringing small businesses to them. I've brought the Randburg Traders, I brought the Soweto Forum, I brought the Soweto Executive Forum, I brought all those guys to our local governments and so on. I've seen how small businesses are not listened to. So, in a very, very simple way, I think the Ministry of Finance can do a little bit on the taxes side, but I think something else has to be done in the minds of South Africans and in the minds of authorities that they don't mess up themselves and say, well, we'll talk about fixing potholes to Lead SA, we'll talk to them, instead of, hey, let's talk to fixing potholes and where the small business traders can trade to the chambers with. I think there's a muddle in this whole process, but that's not to do with the budget, but that is just a point, because Stephen said they listen to small business. I think they listen very selectively to small business, and they get confused with who they're listening to.
That would speak to investment and then future growth in the South African economy. Jackie, are corporate tax levels too high to encourage FDI? And do you see a chance of that being lowered?
Yeah, it's interesting. Corporate taxes, of course, we've seen the 28% rate for a few years now. It hasn't been adjusted. And dividends tax came in higher than what was originally anticipated. We thought it sort of 10, 12% came in at 15%. So actually you saw that tax increase. But dividends tax is not a tax on corporates, of course. It's a tax on investors, and specifically individual investors. So to go back to the company tax rate of 28%, it is a little high compared to international norms, I guess, and there might be a lot of argument to say we should lower it to attract investment, but again, that question of attracting investment is not specifically linked to the tax rate. There's all sorts of other things, all other factors that would impact the attraction of foreign investment. So to just lower the company tax rate, I don't think that that's going to necessarily improve foreign investment right now. There's just too many other factors that need to be addressed.
Stephen, do you see any policy change after the elections?
Well, I think what's being signalled very clearly is that serious policy change will be negotiated. If you look at the governing party's manifesto, there are proposals in there for policy change, some of which many people in business might want to oppose, proposals for narrowing wage differentials, for specific forms of regulation of the financial sector. But it's become very clear that these are simply proposals. These are not decisions. And the most obvious illustration of why we know that they're not decisions, they are proposals, was the rather interesting response of the Minister of Labour to the question of the minimum wage. There's a proposal in the manifesto for the national minimum wage, and the Minister's response was, yes, we're taking this very seriously, we're going to investigate it for the next 5 years, which doesn't sound to me like a very strong sense of urgency, but they're putting it out there because they want it negotiated. So, whether you like the process or not, I think that what people in business need to do is to see what government is putting on the table at the moment as proposals rather than decisions. And therefore, I wouldn't expect significant policy changes after the election, but I think that there's a very strong chance that there might be pressure to begin a policy process which would take off shortly after the election.
I'm not sure who to direct this question to, but there's been lots of speculation about who the next finance minister is possibly going to be. Lots of rumors doing the rounds. Who would you definitely not want to see take up a seat at the helm? Anyone bold enough to venture down this avenue?
Who, me? Trevor Manuel. I'm very fond of Trevor, but actually, who I would not want to see. The reason I said Trevor Manuel, despite I hope a great deal of mutual respect, is that rather than talk about individuals, whether our current finance minister is back again after the election, and I certainly think that there's a chance that he may be, I think that I don't think people appreciate what the role of the finance minister has been over the last 5 years. I think that if Trevor Manuel had been finance minister over the last 5 years, the deficit would be significantly bigger than it is. And I say that not because I think that Trevor is in favour of deficits. It's just that Pravin Gordhan's skill in dealing with the question of fiscal discipline, I think is extremely impressive. In other words, to put it very crudely, Trevor Manuel used to yell at people and say, you're being wasteful. Pravin Gordhan smiles at them, tells them that they have an excellent point, pats them on the back, and as they get halfway down the corridor, they realize that they haven't got anything, but it's too late because they can't go back. And I think that it is very important that whether it's Pravin Gordhan again or somebody else, that the next finance minister understands the politics of what she or he is dealing with and understands the need to take constituencies with them, because I think this finance minister has shown that that is possible. You can do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're close to wrapping up today's event. Is there any final question from our audience today?
My name is Denk Lepsch. I just want to make a comment with regard to the suggestion that Ronald made that a trust might be a cheap way to afford a girlfriend. I think it's important to understand that you have to set that trust up properly, administer it properly, but if you do not do that and your wife become aware of your girlfriend, first the attorney will take your money and she will take what is left.
On that note, a good place to leave it, I guess. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having been with us this morning here, and to our viewers as well, thank you for joining us throughout this 2-hour broadcast. Our esteemed panel of guests this morning, Mike Schisler, Professor Stephen Friedman, Professor Jackie Arendse, Ronald King, and Christa Janse van Rensburg. From me, Alicia Seckham, it's goodbye.